I'm from the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission based in Portland, Oregon. I am a member, however, of the Hudson tribe from Fort Berthold, North Dakota. So I'm partly in the club, but not completely in the club with respect to the treaty tribes of the Columbia River. Those 4 tribes are the Yakima Nation in south central Washington state, the Nez Perce tribe in Idaho, the Umatilla and Warm Springs tribes in Oregon. 4 tribes with treaty rights to salmon, 4 tribes with significant land bases and significant court-mandated co-management responsibility for management of salmon and co-management. Water data and fish data, there's not much fish data, it's more water data, is Columbia specific, but you can make reasonable comparisons with Puget Sound watersheds and Oregon and Washington coastal watersheds. Very simply, our tribes organize both culturally and governmentally around what we call the first foods concept. And this is actually integrated into the constitutions of the Umatilla tribe, something called Temenwit, which means the teachings or the law, and first foods management is the test. So in other words, how does any tribal decision affect first foods? And the reason I wanted to start with this, water of course being the central of first foods, but salmon, game, roots, and berries, and this is exactly how you would see them served at a traditional meal in the Columbia Plateau. Foods on the right harvested by men, cooked by men, served by men. Foods on the left harvested by women, cooked by women, served by women. So they're known as the brother and sister foods. The harvesting of these species dictated tribal movement within their watersheds. So rather than being a longitudinal migratory people, tribal people of the Columbia Plateau were more vertical oriented. In other words, fish in the spring, roots in the spring, game and berries as the year progressed. The thing about climate change that we are seeing and we are hearing regularly from tribal people in the Longhouse is they have always known the roots and the spring Chinook to arrive at exactly the same time. They've always known that. However, over the last decade plus, we are seeing a divergence in that spring Chinook arriving later and roots ripening earlier. It's generally believed it's caused by climate variation, and both temperate in the ripening of early ripening of roots, but also the lack of a defined spring freshet to bring spring Chinook salmon upriver. There's no pulse in the lower river or ocean, not as much at any rate, to tell them this way to the river, this way upriver. But their biology tells them they have to go at some point. That's generally believed to be the cause of the divergence of those first foods. Of course, treaties, Puget Sound tribes similarly have treaties, often known as the Treaties of 1854 and 1855, that define right to take fish, usual and accustomed fishing places. This is a map of the Columbia, one map of the Columbia, an area about the size of France. It drains Snake River in southern Idaho, a major tributary, headwaters up in Canada. Some headwaters also flow down into Montana and back up into Canada, or out of Canada into Montana and Idaho and then back up. What the circles represent, well, what all of the bars represent are major dams. There are many, many, many smaller dams and diversions and dikes. These are major dams. The red circled dams represent blocked fish passage. So you can see much, or virtually all of Canada is no longer accessible to salmon by salmon up the Clearwater River at Dworshak, and then the Snake River at Hell's Canyon. Pretty simple graph showing the decline in the Columbia Basin, overharvest, dam development, habitat destruction, kind of a well-known story in the Northwest. These are our 4 tribes. The light green represents the ceded territories, that is, the territories relinquished by treaty in exchange for their current reservation lands and those reserved rights, like catching fish, accessing hunting areas. There's some dated language that has still not been clearly interpreted, but it has to do with springs, which is important around water rights issues, accessing groundwater resources, pasturing livestock, that sort of thing. So, getting into the climate issue, this represents in a cross section the lands of our 4 tribes, and it moves west to east, and we consider 4,000 feet the tipping point, the threshold where, and this very generally speaking, water and snow, it's basically the snow line in the Columbia Basin. And as climate effects play out over time, you're going to see those basins that depend on snowpack, and are at that tenuous, much of their snowpack at that tenuous 4,000 feet level, are going to be more so impacted by climate change. So you look at the Nez Perce, who's on the far right, much of their reservation is above 4,000 feet. This is not just the reservation, this is their ceded territories as well. So their salmon lands. This would be up in the Bitterroot Wilderness, the northern Idaho, the Lochsa River, the Wallowas, so on and so forth. They're pretty safe. So those steelhead, spring Chinook should have some pretty safe access up in those areas. Umatilla, Yakima on the bottom, and the Warm Springs you've got over on the left side. You've got Mount Hood, and then on that actually runs north to south. The Warm Springs does. You've got Sisters, Mount Jefferson on the south end. So they've got some high country, but just not a lot of precip and snow falls. I mean, some, but not as much. And then the Umatilla, desperately lacking in high elevation, and the Yakima as well. You've got Mount Adams way over on the left side. This is daytime over the last 100 years observed deviation or change in air temperature, in every instance going up from, and these are measured in subbasins. So you can see the Wenatchee, or rather the white salmon is fairly low at 0.2% to, what do we have? The Imnaha at almost 2 degrees increase. Nighttime air temperatures, a little bit more variation. And then this, due to those air changes, temperature changes, this is observed precip during the same time. And in many of these areas, most of these areas, you're seeing more precipitation, but more of it falling as rain. The upper or mid-Columbia, the Metcalf, Entiat, fair amount of precipitation, but a lot of rain. Clearwater, a little more arid over in the interior basin, getting a bit more precipitation, half inch or so, but as well, rain-snow mix. And what that means, I will have a graph, I may have these out of a perfect order, is that the hydrograph, that is the yearly water cycle of which salmon adapted to, with a low flow in the winter, a peak in the spring and summer, and a tapering off. Those important spring and summer flows that move juvenile fish out to the ocean are starting to diminish. So as more precip falls as rain, it immediately runs out of the system. It's not held in the form of snow. So that spring freshet from climate alone is starting to diminish. The median of the flow, you can see, similarly, is moving earlier in the year. So in almost every case, five days earlier, 12 days earlier, 2 days, 8 days, 10 days. Again, this is the earlier snowmelt, more rain, earlier snowmelt, and therefore the whole hydrological calendar is getting squished and moved earlier in the year, or flattening out. You got to put on top of that river management as well, and there's water management on top of that. So we argue for a good freshet, even with the dams in place. Let's make sure that we're not holding water for summer use, for instance, but let it flow out. It's also important to remember these are tributaries. It's not necessarily the big storage reservoirs. So the tributaries are pulsing earlier. What are the consequences? We've got summer water temperature. With lower water in the summer, that means warmer water. And you're seeing water temperatures in the Snake, up to in the 70. I mean, at times, up to 70. I've seen 77 degrees mentioned or measured in 4 bays. That's 10 degrees warmer than you want salmon to be in. It can affect the juveniles out migrating who residualize in that warm water, and when you've got fall Chinook coming up in August and September as they are now, that water temperature gets too hot and their fitness, their ability to reproduce diminishes. You see warmer winter water will expedite the incubation process. Of course, invasive species, flourish, bass, walleye, shad, major invasive species in the Columbia River, mussels and mud snails, etc., prosper more in these warmer waters. And things I think you've heard globally about weather patterns and the Arctic. So here's one of the issues as journalists I hope you will take a good close look at. Columbia River Treaty. It's about a 50-year-old water treaty between the United States and Canada. I'll try not to be too jaundiced in my characterization of it, but it was it's primarily, it's solely a hydropower and flood control based treaty at the moment. Tribes are advocating strongly for ecological functions to be not just part of, but to have equity in a modernized and improved treaty. The treaty will transition in 2024. I believe that's the 60-year birthday. And either the United States or Canada can signal its intentions to the other country on negotiation, termination, whatever. There is a frantic and complex analysis going on the United States side right now, and I'm certain with Canada, to weigh the benefits, the pros and cons. It's a multi-layered effort. Something called the U.S. entity is guiding the U.S. reconsideration. The tribes, 15 tribes of the Columbia Basin, are very involved and doing a lot of the ecological work as well as cultural resource work. And we have a deadline of this December to deliver a Northwest recommendation to the State Department. So this is, the dark blue shows the historic hydrograph with low water in the winter, that peak in May, June. You can see the lighter blue line represents a more modern 1960 to 1980, both hydro and weather-related morphing of that hydrograph. Less snow, more rain. The peak is pinched, and now with the federal biological opinion, incidentally, there are 13 endangered species of salmon in the Columbia Basin. So federal ESA is a major factor in river and harvest management. These are the dams that were constructed, 3 up in Canada and Libya in the US, as part of the treaty agreement. Major storage of water up in Canada, even though it's not, in terms of acreage, a huge part of the basin. In terms of the water it contributes, it's massive, very high mountains, a lot of snow, and that water is very, very valuable for all purposes: fish, hydropower generation, irrigation, you name it. But to prevent flooding downstream, primarily those dams were constructed primarily as flood control dams. So these are the 15 tribes in the Columbia Basin. I work for the 4 that I mentioned earlier, but there's a historic collaboration between us. I can tell you, these 15 tribes have rarely agreed on anything, but the fact that we have unified on the Columbia River Treaty speaks to the importance of it. These are some actions that we can take Columbia River Treaty-wise, and it's really both the US and Canada. Work on the headwaters. We need to collaborate. Instead of looking at Canada as an adversary, we need to start looking at them as a partner in Columbia Basin management. We've received signals that they want fish, they want salmon back after 70 years, or 70, 80 years now, going on 80 without salmon. They'd like to have some salmon back up. It's technologically possible. They can't do it without the assistance of the United States. We should, for climate change reasons alone, and if we want salmon in the Columbia Basin, the biggest salmon producing river in the lower 48, contributes to Washington, coastal harvest, Canada, you name it, we should find new salmon habitat. And if Canada wants it, we want it. We'd like to see that put on the table as a collaborative piece of a improved Columbia River Treaty. We need to get better collaborative forecasting. The old yardsticks in the snow serve their purpose. They're not perfect. They measure snowpack, but they don't measure water volume very well. The more of the pillow monitors that measure snow weight are a better indicator of water content of the snowpack. So there are ways to improve those, more frequent forecasting and more collaborative forecasting. The Canadian entitlement is a buzzword you will hear from hydropower industry and utilities, which represents a payment to Canada for, it's 1/2 of what's considered a downstream benefit. I think we can work collaboratively with our hydropower interests to recalibrate that, to take ecological functions out of that equation and not force utilities and ratepayers to pay for something that they're not switching their light on necessarily and receiving. Thank you.